I told her that road was mine the moment the diesel engine started rumbling. But by the time the steel gate came down, she'd already made the biggest mistake of her life. The cold morning air hit my face as I stepped out onto the porch, the smell of wet soil and hay mixing with something new, fresh paint and hot metal. That wasn't supposed to be there. Not on my land. Not on my road. I could hear it before I saw it, the faint metallic rattle of a chain swaying in the breeze, tapping against something solid. My boots crunched over gravel as I walked down the slope, every step slower than the last, like my body already knew what I was about to find. And then it came into view. A steel barricade, 8 feet wide, bolted into posts that hadn't existed yesterday. A bright white sign hung dead center. Private community access, and no trespassing. I stopped about 10 yards out, just staring at it, the early sun reflecting off that polished metal like it belonged there, like it had always been there. But I knew every inch of this land. I knew the way the tires used to leave tracks after rain, the way my dad taught me to ride this road on an old tractor when I was 12, how the gravel shifted under weight just enough to hum through the steering wheel. And now there was a gate sitting right on top of it like history didn't matter. Like I didn't matter. I ran my hand along the cold steel, feeling the sharp edges where it had been welded in a hurry, the faint smell of burnt metal still clinging to it. That's when I heard her voice behind me, smooth and sweet like she was selling something. Ethan, you really shouldn't be down here. This is community property now. I didn't even turn around at first. I didn't have to. I already knew the tone, that carefully practiced calm that people use when they think they've already won. Brenda Whitmore, HOA president, white Lexus, clipboard, always smiling like she was doing you a favor while tightening the rules around your throat. I finally looked back at her, standing there in pressed khakis and sunglasses, holding a folder like it made everything official. Behind her, 2 contractors leaned against their truck, watching the whole thing like it was just another job. You blocked my access road, I said, keeping my voice level, even though I could feel something tightening in my chest. She tilted her head, that same rehearsed smile never slipping. It's been reclassified as a shared easement for the new development. Perfectly legal. The word legal hung in the air like it was supposed to end the conversation. Like that was it. Case closed. But the thing about words like that is they only work if they're true. I looked back at the gate, then down at the tire marks that still ran straight up to it, stopping just inches short like they'd been cut off mid-sentence. That road had been there for over 70 years. Longer than her HOA. Longer than her subdivision. Longer than any paperwork she thought she could wave around. And in that moment, standing there with the smell of diesel still lingering from yesterday's work and the sound of that chain tapping in the wind, I realized something simple. She didn't just block my road. She thought she could erase it. And what she didn't know was that I'd spent years operating machines built to move things a whole lot stronger than a steel gate. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 38 years old, and everything that matters in my life sits on the other side of that road. 47 acres of Texas soil that has been in my family since my grandfather bought it back in 1956, long before anyone thought about subdivisions or homeowners associations or turning pasture into cul-de-sacs. He paid $8,000 for it, cash, after coming back from Korea with a bad knee and his stubborn belief that land meant freedom. My father kept that belief alive. He raised cattle on these fields, fixed every fence with his own hands, and taught me that if you take care of the land, it will take care of you. I can still hear his voice every time I step outside before sunrise, that low rumble over the sound of boots on gravel, telling me to listen to the ground, to feel it, to understand it. That road Brenda just blocked is not just dirt and rock. It is the spine of everything we built here. It runs a little over half a mile from the county. Road straight through the front pasture, curving just enough to follow the natural slope, ending right at the equipment shed where my tractor still sits, the same one my dad let me drive when I could barely reach the pedals. You learn a lot from a machine like that. You learn patience, control, and how much force it really takes to move something that does not want to move. Before I came back to the farm full-time, I spent 10 years working heavy equipment jobs across 3 states, clearing land, moving earth, operating machines that could shift 20 tons of material like it was nothing. That kind of work teaches you to see structures differently. You stop looking at things as permanent. Fences, walls, barriers, they all have limits. They all have weak points. And you learn exactly how much pressure it takes before something gives. When my dad passed 5 years ago, I came home for good. No more contracts, no more moving around. Just this land, the cattle, and a routine that made sense again. Mornings started before daylight, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, boots hitting the porch, that familiar smell of diesel and hay mixing in the cool air. I kept things simple. I stayed within the law, paid my taxes, maintained my fences. Never had a single issue with anyone until the subdivision started creeping closer. It began with survey stakes at the edge of my north pasture, little orange flags that did not belong. Then came the sound of construction in the distance, nail guns popping like distant fireworks, trucks coming and going at all hours. Willow Creek Estates, they called it. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, and a set of rules thick enough to choke a man who just wanted to mind his own business. I stayed out of it. That was their world, not mine. But land does not care about boundaries on paper. It connects. And sooner or later, someone always decides they want a piece of what is not theirs. The first time I saw Brenda Whitmore, she was standing at the edge of my property line in a pair of sunglasses and spotless white sneakers, looking out over my pasture like she was evaluating it for sale. She smiled when she saw me, that same practiced smile she used this morning, and introduced herself like we were about to become neighbors in the friendly sense of the word. I remember the faint scent of expensive perfume cutting through the smell of fresh cut grass, completely out of place out here. She talked about community growth, about shared benefits, about how access points might need to be adjusted as the neighborhood expanded. At the time, I just nodded and told her that road was private, always had been. She smiled a little tighter after that, like she had just filed something away. I did not think much of it then. I should have, because people like Brenda do not ask questions unless they already have a plan. And standing there now, with that steel gate cutting straight across the only path in and out of my farm, I could feel it in my chest as clear as the hum of an engine warming up. This was never about improving access. This was about taking control, one piece at a time, and expecting me to step aside while they did it. Brenda Whitmore was the kind of woman who never raised her voice because she never had to. The kind who carried authority the way some people carry a handbag, always visible, always intentional, always meant to be noticed. She drove a white Lexus SUV that stayed cleaner than most people's kitchen counters, and she stepped out of it like every driveway she touched belonged to her. There was always a clipboard in her hand or tucked under her arm, pages of rules and regulations that she treated less like guidelines and more like weapons. I learned quickly that she did not see herself as a neighbor. She saw herself as management. The first real sign came about 3 weeks after that initial conversation at the fence line. I found a notice taped to the wooden post near my cattle gate, bright white paper flapping in the wind like it was trying to get my attention. The sound of it snapping against the wood was sharp, repetitive, impossible to ignore. I pulled it down and read it twice just to make sure I was not missing something. It claimed I was in violation of community aesthetic standards. Grass height inconsistency. Equipment visibility. Unauthorized agricultural structures. I remember standing there with that paper in my hand, the smell of dry grass and dust all around me, trying to understand how land that had been here for nearly 70 years suddenly needed approval from a subdivision that had not even finished pouring its sidewalks. I walked that notice back up to the house, set it on the kitchen table, and made myself a cup of coffee before doing anything else. That was something my father taught me. Do not react fast. Think first. But Brenda was not interested in patience. 2 days later, she showed up in person. I heard the tires on gravel before I saw her, that soft crunch rolling up my drive, followed by the click of a car door closing with precision. She did not wait for an invitation. She walked straight up to the porch like she had every right to be there, heels tapping lightly against the wood, sunglasses still on even though she was standing in the shade. "Ethan," she said, like we were picking up a conversation that had never ended. I wanted to follow up on the notice. Her voice was smooth, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something firm, like a line had already been drawn and she expected me to step behind it. I leaned against the doorframe, coffee in hand, and let her talk. She explained how Willow Creek Estates had recently expanded its jurisdictional review zone, how surrounding properties now fell under visual impact considerations, how maintaining a certain standard benefited everyone in the area. Every sentence sounded polished, rehearsed, like she had delivered it a dozen times already to people who eventually just nodded and agreed. When she finished, I asked her one simple question. Does your paperwork say you own any part of my land? She paused just long enough to tell me she did not like the direction of that question. Then she smiled again, tighter this time. Ownership is not the only factor here. That was the moment I understood exactly what I was dealing with. This was not about rules. This was about control. Over the next few weeks, the notices kept coming. Different violations, same tone. Each one a little more aggressive than the last. They cited sections of bylaws I had never agreed to, referenced authority that did not extend beyond the edge of her subdivision, and carried the quiet assumption that I would eventually comply just to make the problem go away. But I did not. I documented everything. Every letter, every date, every interaction. Because something about the way she operated felt calculated, like she was building a case piece by piece, waiting for the right moment to push further. And that moment came the morning I heard unfamiliar trucks idling near the road, engines low and steady, followed by the sound of metal being unloaded. I stepped outside and felt it immediately, that shift in the air, like something permanent was about to happen. I did not know exactly what she was planning yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Brenda Whitmore was done asking. The engines had been running for at least 20 minutes before I got down there, that low steady hum carrying across the pasture like a warning I should have recognized sooner, and by the time my boots hit the gravel, they were already halfway through the job. 2 trucks, both marked with a contractor logo I did not recognize, sat angled along the edge of my road, their diesel fumes thick in the morning air, mixing with the sharp scent of freshly cut metal. A crew of 4 men moved with the kind of efficiency that only comes from following orders, not asking questions. Steel posts were already set into the ground at even intervals, each one sunk deep and locked in place with fast-setting concrete that had not fully dried yet. I could see the wet gray surface still settling, still soft enough to leave a mark if you pressed it. And stretched between those posts was the beginning of something that did not belong here. Panels of reinforced steel fencing, bolted tight, forming a barrier that cut clean across the road like it had been planned down to the inch. I stopped about 15 feet away, taking it in, listening to the sound of impact drivers tightening bolts, the metallic clicks echoing in the open space where there used to be nothing but wind and gravel. One of the workers glanced at me, then back to his task, like I was just another part of the background. That was when I spoke. You are building on private property. My voice came out calm, steady, but it carried. They all paused for just a second, not enough to stop, just enough to acknowledge that I was there. The foreman stepped forward, wiping his hands on a rag, eyes already tired. Like he had dealt with this kind of conversation before. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and held it out, not handing it to me, just showing it like it was enough. Work order, he said. Authorized access control installation. I did not take the paper. I did not need to. I could already see the problem. No survey lines. No county markings. Just a logo from the HOA printed at the top like it carried weight it did not actually have. I shook my head slowly. That does not give you the right to build here. Before he could answer, I heard the sound I had been expecting. Tires on gravel. Smooth, controlled, deliberate. Brenda's Lexus rolled into view and stopped just short of the construction line, engine idling like she was enjoying the timing of it all. She stepped out, sunglasses already on, that same composed expression fixed in place. Ethan, she called, like this was a scheduled meeting. I see you found the improvement project. Improvement. The word landed wrong, like it did not belong anywhere near what I was looking at. I gestured toward the fence, toward the concrete still setting in the ground. You are blocking my only access road. She walked closer, heels steady, never once looking at the workers, because she did not need to. They were already doing exactly what she wanted. We are formalizing it, she said. This access point is being integrated into the community infrastructure. I let that sit for a second, feeling the heat from the rising sun, the grit of dust against my skin, the faint vibration of machinery still running behind me. It is not community infrastructure, I said. It is private agricultural access. Always has been. She tilted her head slightly, that small gesture she used when she was about to disagree without raising her voice. That is one interpretation. Interpretation, like land ownership, was something you could adjust depending on what suited you. I looked down at the ground, at the tire tracks that still ran straight through the section they were closing off, deep grooves pressed into the dirt from years of use. then back up at the steel cutting across it. They had already installed the central gate by then, a heavy panel with a locking mechanism mounted clean and tight, the chain hanging loose for now, but ready. I could hear it moving slightly in the breeze, that soft metallic tap repeating over and over. "You need to stop this," I said. "Right now." Brenda did not even hesitate. "It is already approved." And that was it. No discussion. No compromise. Just a statement delivered like the outcome had already been decided long before I showed up. Behind her, one of the workers engaged the final bolt on the gate hinge, the sharp mechanical whine cutting through the air before snapping into silence. The barrier was complete, and standing there, watching that last piece lock into place, I felt something shift. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a mistake. This was a line being drawn straight through my property with the expectation that I would accept it. But I did not move. I did not argue further. I just stood there, listening to the quiet settle in after the tool stopped, the road on the other side suddenly out of reach, and realized something simple and clear. This was no longer a conversation. This was a problem that was going to require a very different kind of solution. I did not touch the gate that day. I did not grab the chain, did not test the lock, did not give Brenda the reaction she was clearly waiting for. Instead, I turned around and walked back up the road, every step slow and measured, the sound of gravel under my boots louder than it should have been, like the ground itself was reminding me that something had just changed. The air felt different, heavier, like the land was holding its breath. Back at the house, I set my keys on the counter, poured another cup of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table with that same stack of notices she had been sending me for weeks. I spread them out one by one, lining them up like pieces of a puzzle, each page stamped with the same HOA letterhead, each one pushing a little further than the last. There was a pattern there. I could see it now. This was not random. This was escalation. I pulled out my laptop and started digging, county records, property maps, anything that showed where my land began and ended. The numbers did not lie. The road was mine. Always had been. Registered, recorded, taxed, maintained by my family long before. Willow Creek Estates even existed on paper. I printed everything I found, stacked it neatly, and drove into town that afternoon. The lawyer's office sat on the corner of Main Street, brick building, faded sign, the kind of place that smelled faintly like old paper and dust. I explained the situation, laid out the documents, and watched his expression shift as he flipped through the pages. He nodded slowly, tapped the edge of the file, and told me what I already knew. "On paper, you are right." Then he paused, leaned back in his chair, and added the part that mattered. "But that does not mean this gets resolved quickly." He explained how these things drag out, how homeowners associations push boundaries because most people do not fight back, how legal challenges take time, money, and patience. Weeks, maybe months before anything official forced them to stop. I thanked him, gathered my papers, and walked back out into the late afternoon heat with a weight sitting heavy in my chest. Time was the one thing I did not have. The next morning proved it. I woke up before sunrise like always, pulled on my boots, and stepped outside expecting the same routine I had followed for years. But the moment I reached the road, that routine broke. The gate stood there solid and unmoving, chain now locked tight, a fresh sign bolted onto the center panel that read, "Authorized vehicles only." I stood there for a long second, listening to the quiet, no wind, no movement, just the faint creak of metal settling into place. I had a delivery scheduled that morning, a local buyer expecting a load of feed from me by 9 o'clock. The truck arrived right on time, the driver pulling up to the gate and stopping, engine idling, waiting for it to open. I walked down, explained the situation, and watched the confusion spread across his face as he looked from me to the barrier blocking the only path forward. There was no way around it. No alternate route. The pasture stretched wide on both sides, uneven ground, fencing, nothing a loaded truck could cross safely. After 10 minutes of standing there, going back and forth, we both came to the same conclusion without needing to say it out loud. He turned the truck around and left. I stood there until the sound of the engine faded completely, the silence that followed hitting harder than anything else that had happened so far. That was the moment it stopped being theoretical. This was not just about land or paperwork anymore. This was affecting my work, my income, my ability to run the farm the way it was meant to run. And Brenda knew it. Every notice, every step, Every piece of that fence had been placed with that exact outcome in mind. I tried again that afternoon, drove into the HOA office, a small unit tucked into a shopping strip just outside the subdivision. The air inside was cool, artificial, carrying the faint scent of air freshener that tried too hard. Brenda sat behind her desk like she had been expecting me, hands folded neatly, posture perfect. I placed my documents in front of her, explained the situation clearly, calmly, gave her every chance to correct it before things went further. She listened without interrupting, then glanced down at the papers for just a moment before sliding them back toward me. "You should have addressed these concerns earlier," she said, her voice steady, almost sympathetic. "At this point, the project is already in motion." I held her gaze for a second, searching for anything that suggested this could still be resolved the simple way. There was nothing there. Just certainty. Just control. I picked up my documents, turned, and walked out without another word. Because standing there in that air-conditioned office, with that polished desk and that practiced tone, I finally understood something I should have realized from the start. This was not a situation I was going to win by asking. The next 48 hours were where everything tightened, not all at once, but in small, deliberate steps that made it impossible to ignore what was happening. It started with the second sign. I noticed it just after sunrise, bolted right below the first one, bright red lettering this time, sharp against the steel. Unauthorized use subject to fine. The paint was still fresh, the edges clean, like it had been put up overnight. I stood there for a moment, reading it twice, feeling that same quiet pressure building in my chest. This was not just about blocking access anymore. This was about establishing control. By mid-morning, a white pickup I had never seen before rolled up and parked just inside the subdivision side of the gate. A man in a security uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand, radio clipped to his shoulder, like this stretch of dirt road suddenly required supervision. He nodded at me once, polite but distant, then took up position near the gate like he had been assigned to guard something valuable. I did not say anything. I just watched. Because I was starting to understand the pattern. They were layering authority. First the fence, then the signage, now the presence. Each piece reinforcing the last, making it look official enough that most people would not question it. By noon, my phone started ringing. First it was the feed supplier asking why the morning delivery had been turned away. Then it was a neighbor from down the county road who had heard there was an issue with access. Word travels fast out here, faster than most people expect. Every call was another reminder that this situation was already reaching beyond my property line. By the afternoon, the impact got sharper. The milk collection service I contract with called to confirm pickup for the next morning, and I had to explain that their truck would not be able to reach the barn. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a quiet, "We will have to reschedule." That word lingered longer than it should have. Reschedule. Like this was temporary. Like it would just sort itself out. But standing there with the gate still locked and that security guard pacing slow circles near it, I knew better. This was not temporary. This was designed to stay until I gave in. I spent that evening walking the perimeter of my land, boots dragging slightly through the dry grass, thinking through options. The fence line on the east side ran along a shallow creek, uneven ground, not something you could push a loaded vehicle through without risking damage. The west side dropped into a low ravine, soft soil that would swallow tires after even a little rain. There was no alternate access that made sense, not without major work, permits, time. Time I did not have. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the pasture, and for the first time since this started, I felt the weight of it settle fully. This was pressure. Calculated, precise pressure. Back at the house, I sat at the kitchen table again, the same stack of documents spread out in front of me. But this time I was not just reading them. I was studying them, looking for anything that had been missed, any detail that did not line up with what Brenda was claiming. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. Hours passed without me noticing, and then something small caught my eye. A date, not on my deed, but on one of the subdivision filings I had printed earlier. I leaned closer, reading it again, slower this time. The timeline did not match what she had told me. The so-called integration of that access point had been filed after the fence construction was already scheduled, not before, which meant one simple thing. They did not have approval when they started. I sat back in my chair, letting that settle in, feeling the first shift in momentum since this all began. It was small, just a crack, but I had spent enough years around heavy equipment to know exactly what a crack meant. It meant something had been pushed too far, too fast, without the support it needed to hold. And once that happens, it is only a matter of time before the pressure finds its way through. Once you see a crack, you cannot unsee it, and that date sat there in black ink like a loose bolt on a machine that was already under too much strain. I leaned forward, elbows on the table, and read through the filing again, slower this time, tracing every line like I was checking a blueprint. The subdivision expansion paperwork had been submitted 3 days after the contractor invoice was issued for the fence installation. Not approved, not even reviewed. Submitted. That meant when those steel posts went into my ground, they were not backed by any official authorization beyond whatever Brenda claimed in conversation. The air in the room felt different after that, sharper somehow, like the moment before a storm breaks. I gathered every document I had printed, stacked them neatly, and added the new ones on top, organizing them in a way that made the timeline impossible to ignore. Dates, signatures, filing numbers. When you lay things out right, the truth does not need much explanation. The next morning, I did not go to the gate first. I went straight into town. The county records office opened at 8:30, and I was there 10 minutes early, leaning against the counter while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the smell of old paper hung in the air. The clerk behind the desk recognized me, gave a small nod, and asked what I needed. I slid the documents across and told her I wanted confirmation on the subdivision filings, specifically the access reclassification Brenda had been referencing. She adjusted her glasses, scanned the pages, then turned to her computer, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. The clicking filled the silence while I stood there, waiting, feeling that same steady build of pressure in my chest. After a minute, she stopped, leaned closer to the screen, and frowned slightly. "This is still pending," she said. "There is no approval on record." I let that settle for a second, just to be sure I heard it right. "So there is no legal change to that road?" She shook her head. "Not at this time." That was it. No drama. No raised voices. Just a simple confirmation that everything Brenda had been operating on was not finalized, not recognized, not enforceable the way she was presenting it. I thanked her, took my documents, and stepped back out into the morning light, the heat already starting to rise off the pavement. For the first time since the gate went up, something inside me shifted in the opposite direction. This was not me reacting anymore. This was me understanding. Back at the farm, the scene at the road had not changed. The gate still stood firm, chain locked, signs in place, and that same security guard pacing slow circles like he was part of the structure itself. I walked down at a steady pace, boots kicking up dust, and stopped a few feet from the barrier. The guard glanced at me, then at the folder in my hand, his posture tightening, just slightly. "Access is restricted," he said, like he had rehearsed it. I nodded once, calm. "I am aware." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I just looked past him, down the length of that road, the one I had driven 1,000 times without thinking, now sitting there like it belonged to someone else. Then I looked at the posts, the bolts, the concrete, still visible at the base, and I started seeing it differently. Not as a wall, as a structure. Something built under the assumption that it would not be challenged. Something put up fast, without the proper foundation behind it. I turned and walked back toward the equipment shed, the sound of my steps steady, deliberate, each one falling into a rhythm I recognized from years of work. Planning, measuring, calculating. Inside the shed, the air was cooler, carrying that familiar mix of oil, dust, and metal that never really leaves. And there it was, parked exactly where I left it. The tractor, old, worn in all the right places, paint faded but solid, engine maintained the way my father taught me. I ran my hand along the side, feeling the texture of the metal, the slight warmth it held from the day before. Machines like this do not lie. They do exactly what they are built to do. And as I stood there in that quiet space, listening to the faint ticking sound of metal settling, I realized something simple. Brenda thought she had closed a road. What she had really done was create a situation where every decision she made now had consequences she could not control. And for the first time since this started, I knew exactly where to begin. I did not start the engine that afternoon, not yet, because rushing into a solution without understanding every angle is how you lose control of a situation like this. Instead, I went back to the house and cleared off the kitchen table completely, pushing aside everything that was not part of the problem until all that remained were documents, maps, and a single legal pad. The ceiling fan hummed softly above me, stirring the warm air just enough to keep it moving, and the faint smell of coffee lingered from earlier, grounding me in something familiar while everything else shifted. I laid the county records out first, then the subdivision filings, then the notices Brenda had been sending, arranging them by date until the sequence became obvious even at a glance. It was not just that they acted early. It was how they acted early. The contractor invoice had a timestamp. The delivery log showed materials arriving before any official review had even begun. And the most important detail sat right in the middle of it all, buried in language most people would have skipped over. Proposed access integration pending approval. Proposed. Not granted. Not executed. Proposed. I wrote it down in capital letters on the legal pad, underlining it twice. Then I pulled out the survey map my father had updated years ago, the one that marked every boundary, every easement, every right-of-way connected to the property. The paper was worn at the edges, creased from being folded and unfolded more times than I could count, but the lines were still clear. The road cut straight through the center, labeled as private agricultural access with no shared designation anywhere along its length. I traced it slowly with my finger, following the exact path I had walked 1,000 times, feeling that connection between what was on paper and what existed outside. That was when the second piece clicked into place. It was not just that Brenda lacked approval. It was that she was acting as if approval had already been granted, presenting something incomplete as final, counting on the fact that most people would not check. I sat back in the chair, the wood creaking softly under my weight, and looked out through the window toward the road. From that angle, I could just barely see the top of the gate, the sunlight catching the edge of the steel. It looked solid, permanent, but now I knew it was neither. I spent the next hour going through every detail again, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to be certain. Dates aligned. Language matched. There was no gray area here, just a clear line between what had been approved and what had not. When I finally stood up, the room felt quieter, like something had settled into place. I gathered the documents into a single folder, clipped them together, and set them by the door. Then I walked back out to the equipment shed, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the ground, the heat pressing down in that steady way it does before evening. The tractor sat exactly where I had left it, unchanged, reliable, waiting. I climbed up into the seat and rested my hands on the wheel without turning the key, feeling the worn grip under my palms, the slight give that comes from years of use. Machines respond to input. They do not guess. They do not assume. They do exactly what you tell them to do. And right then, I was not thinking about force. I was thinking about timing. Because what Brenda had done was not just wrong. It was premature. She moved before the system could support her, and that meant every action she took from that point forward rested on something that did not legally exist yet. I looked back toward the road, toward the gate standing there like it had authority, and for the first time since this started, I saw it clearly for what it was. Not an endpoint. A setup. And setups only work if the other person does not recognize them. But I did. And once you recognize a setup, you can decide exactly how and when to turn it around. The next move was not about force. It was about making sure I was not the only one who understood what was happening, because pressure works best when it is seen from more than one angle. I picked up the folder from the table early the next morning, the paper edges crisp under my fingers, and drove down the county road to a place that had been there longer than most people remembered. A small house set back from the road, paint faded, porch sagging just enough to show its age, but still standing solid. Mr. Harold Bennett had lived there for over 60 years, long enough to remember what this land looked like before fences and subdivisions started carving it up. I could smell wood smoke as I stepped out of the truck, that faint familiar scent mixing with dry grass and morning air. He was already outside, sitting in a weathered chair, hat low over his eyes, watching the road like he always did. "Morning, Ethan," he said without getting up, like he had been expecting me. I nodded, walked up, and handed him the folder without saying much. He took his time going through it, turning each page slowly, his fingers rough from years of work, eyes sharp despite his age. The only sound was the occasional rustle of paper and the distant hum of a truck passing somewhere down the highway. When he finished, he leaned back, looked out across the land for a long second, then nodded once. "That road has been yours since before your father was born," he said, voice steady, certain. "Used to drive cattle through there myself back in the 70s. I felt something settle hearing that. Not new information, but confirmation from someone who had seen it firsthand, someone who could not be dismissed as easily as paperwork. "You willing to say that if it comes to it?" I asked. He looked at me, a small smile forming under the brim of his hat. "Son, I have been saying the truth longer than most people have been lying about it." That was enough. I thanked him, took the folder back, and headed into town again, this time to a different office. A surveyor, one my father had used years ago, still operating out of a small building with maps lining the walls and instruments stacked neatly in cases. The air inside smelled like dust and ink, and the sound of a pencil scratching across paper echoed softly as he worked when I walked in. I laid everything out again, explained the situation, and watched him study the maps with a level of focus that told me he already knew where this was going. He pulled out an updated aerial image, overlaid it with my property lines, and pointed directly at the road. "No shared easement here," he said plainly. "Never has been recorded. If anything, they are the ones overstepping." He printed a certified copy of the map, signed it, stamped it, and slid it across the table. Another piece. Another confirmation. By the time I left, the sun was high, the heat rising off the pavement in waves, and the weight I had been carrying since the gate went up had shifted into something more focused. Back at the farm, the scene at the road was unchanged, but it felt different now. The guard still stood there, the sign still hung, the chain still held tight. But I was not looking at it the same way anymore. I had documentation. I had confirmation. And now I had something else. I had witnesses. Not just people who believed me, but people who could back it up, who could stand there and say what was true without hesitation. I walked back to the shed, the folder tucked under my arm, the sound of my steps steady, controlled. Inside, the tractor waited, quiet, patient, exactly where it had always been. I climbed up into the seat again, resting my hands on the wheel, feeling that familiar grip, the connection between control and outcome settling in. Because now it was not just about knowing I was right. It was about being ready to prove it at the exact moment it mattered most. And as I looked out toward the road, toward the gate that Brenda believed had ended this situation, I realized something clear. She had built her entire plan on the assumption that I would either give up or get stuck waiting. But what she did not account for was someone who understood both the law and the timing of when to act on it. And that difference was about to matter. The plan came together the same way any solid operation does, not with noise or rush, but with clarity and timing, each step placed exactly where it needed to be. I started before sunrise the next morning, the sky still dark blue with just a thin line of light breaking over the horizon, the air cool enough to carry every sound further than usual. The smell of diesel hit as soon as I stepped into the shed, familiar and steady, grounding everything that came next. I set the folder down on the workbench, opened it one last time, and ran through the sequence in my head. Documentation confirmed. Timeline verified. Witness ready. No assumptions. No guesswork. Just facts. I pulled out my phone and set it up on a small tripod near the entrance of the shed, angled toward the road, making sure the frame would capture everything clearly. Not for show. For record. Because when things happen fast, people tend to remember them differently than they actually occurred. I was not leaving that part to interpretation. Outside, the world was just starting to wake up, a faint breeze moving through the grass, the distant sound of a truck miles away rolling across open road. I climbed into the tractor seat and paused for a second, hands resting on the wheel, feeling the weight of it, the history of it, every hour it had spent working this land. Then I turned the key. The engine came alive with a deep, steady rumble, not loud, not aggressive, just present, like something that had been waiting for the right moment. I let it idle, listening to the rhythm settle, feeling the slight vibration through the seat, through the wheel, through my hands. Machines tell you when they are ready. This one was. I eased it forward slowly, guiding it out of the shed, the tires rolling over packed dirt, then gravel, each turn deliberate, controlled. As I approached the road, I could already see movement near the gate. The security guard had heard the engine. He stepped forward, posture tightening, one hand resting on his radio, eyes fixed on me as I brought the tractor to a stop about 20 feet from the barrier. The chain hung still, the sign catching the early light, the steel posts standing exactly where they had been placed, unchanged. I let the engine idle, the sound filling the space between us, then reached down and picked up the folder from the seat beside me. I stepped down slowly, boots hitting the ground with a solid crunch, and walked toward the gate, holding the documents where they could be seen clearly. The guard raised a hand slightly, like he was about to speak, but I got there first. "You need to call Brenda," I said, voice calm, steady. Now, there was something in the way I said it that made him pause. Not aggressive, not uncertain, just direct. He hesitated for a second, then reached for his radio, speaking quietly into it. I waited. The morning light grew stronger, stretching shadows across the road, the sound of the engine behind me continuing that low, constant hum. A few minutes later, I heard it. Tires on gravel again. Smooth, controlled, familiar. Brenda's Lexus pulled up and stopped just behind the guard, engine idling, the door opening with that same precise click I had come to recognize. She stepped out, sunglasses already in place, posture unchanged, like this was just another routine interaction she expected to manage. "Ethan," she said, walking forward, eyes moving from me to the tractor and back again. "This is not an authorized use of this access point." I did not respond to that. Instead, I opened the folder and held out the documents, flipping to the pages that mattered, the dates, the filings, the certified map, each one aligned in a way that told the full story without needing explanation. She glanced at them briefly, just long enough to recognize what they were, then looked back up at me, her expression tightening by a fraction. "These matters are still under review," she said. Tone controlled, but firmer now. I nodded once. "Exactly," I replied. "Still under review. Not approved." The words hung there for a second, simple, direct, impossible to twist. The guard shifted slightly to the side, his attention moving between us, the situation no longer as clear as it had been a few minutes earlier. I closed the folder, held it at my side, and looked past the gate, down the length of the road that had never changed ownership no matter what paperwork she tried to rush through. Then I looked back at her, steady, certain, because everything up to this point had been about positioning, about making sure that when the moment came, there would be no confusion about what was happening or why. And standing there with the engine idling behind me, the documents in my hand, and the truth lined up exactly where it needed to be, I knew one thing for certain. This was the moment everything shifted. Brenda held her ground for a moment, her posture still composed, but I could see it now, that small hesitation behind the sunglasses, the kind that only shows up when something does not go according to plan. She was not used to being challenged with facts she could not dismiss. The engine behind me continued its steady hum, low and constant, filling the silence that stretched between us. The guard shifted again, less certain now, his attention no longer fixed on stopping me, but on understanding what exactly he was standing in the middle of. "This installation is part of a pending development plan," Brenda said, her voice still controlled, but tighter now, like she was choosing each word more carefully than before. I nodded once, not interrupting, letting her finish, because sometimes the more someone talks, the clearer the mistake becomes. "Pending," I repeated calmly when she stopped. "Which means it is not active, not enforceable, not yours to control yet." The words landed differently this time, not as an argument, as a statement. I stepped back slowly, not away from the situation, but into position, turning just enough to face both her and the gate at the same time. The morning sun had fully broken over the horizon now, light stretching across the steel panels, casting long shadows that cut across the road in sharp lines. It looked solid. It looked official. But I knew what was underneath it. Rushed work. No authorization. No standing. I glanced once toward the phone mounted on the tripod near the shed, still recording, capturing everything exactly as it was happening. Then back to Brenda. "You built this without approval," I said, voice steady, even. "You restricted access to private agricultural property without legal authority." The guard looked at her, waiting for a response, something that would restore the certainty he had been operating under. But it did not come. Not right away. Brenda adjusted her stance slightly, one hand tightening around the folder she carried, the edges of it pressing into her palm. "You are overstepping," she said finally, but the confidence behind it was thinner now, stretched. I let that sit for a second, then shook my head once. No, I replied. I am correcting it. And with that, I turned back toward the tractor. Each step deliberate, measured, the sound of my boots against the gravel steady and controlled. I climbed up into the seat, settled my hands on the wheel, and let the engine idle for one more second, just long enough for everything to align. No shouting, no sudden moves, just clarity. I eased the tractor forward slowly, the tires rolling over the gravel with that familiar crunch, closing the distance between me and the gate inch by inch. The guard stepped aside without being told, instinct taking over where instruction had failed, his role no longer clear in a situation that had shifted beyond what he was prepared for. Brenda did not move. She stood there, watching, her expression fixed, but no longer certain. The front of the tractor reached the barrier, the steel panels reflecting the morning light, the chain hanging still at the center. I did not accelerate. I did not rush. Without obstruction, silence followed, heavy and complete, broken only by the low idle of the tractor. I looked back at Brenda, meeting her gaze for a brief second, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with certainty. Because everything that had happened in that moment was exactly what the situation required. Nothing more, nothing less. Then I turned forward again, eased the tractor through the opening, and drove down the road that had never stopped being mine. The gravel crunching under the tires the same way it always had, steady, familiar, unchanged. Gave them the facts, clear and simple, referenced the filings, the pending status, the lack of approval. There was a pause, then a response that carried more weight than anything Brenda had said up to that point. We will be reviewing this immediately. That word mattered. Immediately. Not pending. Not delayed. Not under consideration. By early afternoon, a county vehicle pulled up near the road, dust trailing behind it as it slowed to a stop. Two officials stepped out, both carrying clipboards, both moving with the kind of quiet authority that does not need to announce itself. Of the situation moved fully into place. By late afternoon, instructions were given. The barrier would need to be removed. The installation would be reviewed. Further action would be determined based on findings. Simple, direct, final. Brenda did not argue at that point. Not because she agreed, but because there was nothing left to argue against. The structure she had relied on was no longer supporting her position. It had collapsed under its own lack of foundation. As the officials left, the dust from their vehicles settling slowly back onto the road, I stood there for a moment longer, looking at the gate one last time. It had looked permanent just hours earlier. Now it looked temporary, conditional, like something that had already started to disappear, even before it was physically removed. I turned and walked back toward the house, the sound of gravel under my boots steady, the air lighter than it had been in days. Because in the end, nothing about that road had changed. The land was still the land. The boundaries were still the boundaries. The truth had always been there. It just needed the right moment to be seen clearly. The next morning felt different before I even stepped outside. The air lighter, the kind of quiet that does not come from absence but from things settling back into place. I poured my coffee, strong and steady, and walked out onto the porch just as the first lights stretched across the fields, turning the grass gold in that way that never gets old no matter how many years you see it. The road lay ahead exactly as it always had, open, uninterrupted, a simple line of gravel cutting through land that had never belonged to anyone but us. The gate was still there, but it no longer held anything. The chain hung loose, one side of the frame slightly out of alignment, the illusion gone. It looked like what it really was now. Temporary, incorrect, already fading from relevance. I walked down to it slowly, boots steady against the gravel, the same sound I had grown up with, the same rhythm that had carried through every part of this place long before anyone thought they could rewrite it. Up close, I could see where the pressure had shifted the structure just enough to expose the weakness in how it had been set. Not broken in some dramatic way, just corrected. I reached out and rested my hand against the steel for a second, feeling the cool surface under my palm, no longer something that stopped me, just something that had been in the way for a moment. Then I stepped past it without hesitation and kept walking down the road, letting that simple act settle into memory. Because sometimes, the most important thing is not the confrontation. It is what comes after. By mid-morning, a crew had arrived, not the same one from before, this time under county instruction, removing what had never been properly placed to begin with. The sound of tools echoed across the land again, but it was different now, not intrusive, not disruptive, just a process of undoing something that should not have been done. I did not stand there and watch the entire time. I had work to do, cattle to check, equipment to maintain. Life does not pause just because someone else tried to interfere with it. But every now and then, I would glance down the road and see the progress, the posts coming out one by one, the panels being loaded back onto trucks, the space opening up again the way it was meant to be. Brenda did not come back that day, or the day after. And when her name came up a week later, it was not in the same way it had been before. It was quieter, different. There were discussions about review boards, about compliance checks, about how certain decisions had been made too quickly without proper authorization. I did not involve myself in any of that. I did not need to. The outcome had already been set in motion the moment the truth became visible to the right people. By the end of the week, the road was clear again, not just physically, but in every sense that mattered. No signs, no guard, no question about who it belonged to. I drove down it that evening just as the sun dipped low, the sky turning that deep orange that makes everything feel still for a moment. The tractor moved the same way it always had, steady, reliable, the gravel responding under the tires like it recognized what belonged there. I followed the curve, past the same fence posts my father had repaired years ago, the same stretch of land where I had learned how to work, how to listen, how to stand my ground when it mattered. And as I reached the end and turned back toward the house, I realized something simple. Nothing about this was loud. Nothing about it needed to be. The land did not change. The truth did not change. It just waited. And in the end, it does what it always does. It holds its ground longer than anything built on top of it without the right to be there.